And I ran a consulting firm for 15 years before I became a funder in the States. And we did this Path to Impact project with several communities around the United States, taking multiple nonprofits or third sector organizations and analyzing them, and then giving the data back to funders to help funders be better funders, right? Because funders are awesome, but also they have challenges too. And so I'm really excited that we're finally here. And I hope that this is interesting to you. So one is, no one here knows what CCAT is. It's just this weird thing. So I'll introduce it to you, and by the time we're done with that, you'll have a good idea. So let's go right here. So the CCAT's purpose is, number one, the core capacity assessment tool. That's the last time I'll say that full length. It's called the CCAT. Any type of assessment should not be regarded as a report card. The idea behind an organizational scan is that it's a document to help you learn about your organization and learn about yourself so that you can have the right discussions. So in my former life, I used to go to 3 board meetings a week. A sad state of affairs that my life was, but I actually did like going to board meetings. And oftentimes, boards were not having the right conversation. And so what we found is by giving them the proper analysis that they were able to have the right conversation and get to the right places, right? So that's a real big benefit. The CCAT looks at organizations in a pretty comprehensive framework, and the goal behind the CCAT is that it's going to facilitate the right discussions and help you get to the right strategic conversations within your organization. The third one is there are a number of assessment tools that are out there. Our firm looked at 153 organizational assessment tools that existed out there and analyzed and tried to find what are the best ones that kind of help organizations really get a deep understanding of where they are, right? And so, and we found the CCAT to be one that really helps you understand at a very deep level kind of what's going on. We found that it was relatively simple. Sometimes you take an assessment tool and it is actually like going to the doctor and going through lots of pokes and tests and things like that. And the CCAT is relatively painless. It's 146 questions that you can take about a half hour, 45 minutes to complete while you watch your stories on TV at night, whatever you're doing, or listen to the radio or whatever. But it's relatively easy. And the CCAT should be regarded as a leadership tool, right? It's a tool for leaders to be able to look at their organization and think about what are the things that I need to, or other leaders within the organization, or our boards need to employ to help us move forward, okay? Great. So this is really nerdy. So this is a graduate school course in itself, so I'm going to go over this really quickly. But if you think about high impact organizations that are really strong, there are 3 circles that you can look at them. There are 3 things that are going on within an organization at a given point in time, okay? So the first one is, how do organizations relate to their external environment, right? And I think we'll send you this PowerPoint so you don't have to write. I look at Martina and her hand's going to fall off if we don't. So the first one is external environment. You can look at your external environment in 4 ways. The first one is the social and demographic forces that affect your organization and what's going on in your community. Are you all serving the same exact people you were 10 years ago, or do they look different in some way? Probably different than 5 years or maybe even 1 year, right? So it's really important for organizations to be able to understand their communities and be able to assess what's going on in those changes and get out in front of that, right? The second one is technological forces. So how many of you tweet? How many of you were tweeting 5 years ago? Okay, so looking in the world and saying, now tweet is actually a little bit old school if you talk to some folks, right? And Snapchat, and there's going to be something else that's going to be called next week, right? So the idea of organizations to pay attention to technological forces that are going on in the industry so that they can get out in front of that. So that's another thing that high impact organizations look at. Economic forces, right? So the recent economic crisis should not have been a surprise to anybody, right? And good organizations were able to kind of see things were going to turn south and were able to get out in front of that. So technological forces can definitely affect what's going on. And then finally, political and regulatory forces, right? Understanding where government is going, what are the changes that are happening in policy and regulation, and being able to get out in front of that, okay? So high impact organizations look at all of these different things and are able to adapt to that. The second rung is where organizations spend their resources. And typically organizations spend their resources in 6 different ways. The first one is where organizations spend about 80% of their dollars is in human resources, the people that they pay. Okay? The second one is in technology, and that's the actual lights and phones and whatever you're using to make the organization go from a technological standpoint. That's where organizations spend their dollars. The third one is program design and model, right? So if you are a childcare organization, you have a special sauce to how you deliver your services, right? You spend time and energy and resource to make sure that your product gets out into the world in the way that you want it to. So that's another way. The fourth area is your finances and your funding, right? You pay attention to that, right? And so really good organizations are paying attention to how they allocate and how they move and they shift, and they pay attention to their dollars. Fifth one is time, right? So how we spend our time is really important, and good organizations are looking at how they're allocating their time, which does relate to human capital. And then final is your facilities, whether you're renting or owning your facilities, you spend time on that. The middle area is where the CCAT measures, and it measures, the middle one brings in those other 2 rungs. And the CCAT essentially looks at 5 areas. The first area it looks at is your adaptive capacity. How many of you have strategic plans? Okay, so that's awesome, congratulations. The CCAT actually looks at whether you follow through on those strategic plans. 90% of nonprofit strategic plans fail, statistically proven. So, and that's a whole class in itself. But the idea is it's not so much to create a plan as to being a strategic organization that's able to move and shift and shape based on what's going in that external environment. Or how many of you measure stuff, evaluating, okay? Do you change as a result of that measuring? Every January I step on the scale to not be as pear-shaped. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it's not. But the idea is, do you change your behaviors? Do you adapt based on the ability to grab data, right? Or if resources change, can you adapt? Okay, so that's your adaptive capacity. The second rung is your leadership capacity. It looks at board leadership, executive leadership, senior leadership. Are they inspiring? Are they modeling good behavior? Are they directing? Meaning, if you are the leader in your organization, you say, we're going to do this. Do they say, Charlotte doesn't know what she's talking about. That's Charlotte, by the way. I'm going to do whatever I want to do, right? I'm assuming Charlotte says what's going to happen, they're going to follow. Management capacity is your ability to manage that second rung, which is largely people. How well you manage your people. How do you communicate with your people? And a variety of other kind of management indicators. The fourth one is your technical capacity. This is the stuff that you often complain about. I don't have enough money. Anybody have enough money and they're sitting pretty? All right, one person in the back with the camera. I don't believe him. Or evaluation, or facilities, or service delivery. All the technical stuff that makes up how you do your work, that we measure that. And then the final one is organizational culture. So that is, how does this organization feel to me? What's it like to work here? Is it an energizing place to be? Or am I just coming here and going through the motions? Because in the nonprofit sector, is anybody working for the cash? No one's getting rich, right? The number one reason people work in the nonprofit sector is because they want to have change in their community and they want to be recognized for that change. And so you want to work in an environment where you feel like you can change the community and the mission that you're involved in. So the CCAT looks at that, and there are 36 indicators that it looks at when it's there. So let's go into that a little bit. So I kind of talked about this. Leadership capacity is the ability of all organizational leaders to create vision, inspire, model, and prioritize, make decisions, provide direction, be innovative. Adaptive capacity is the ability for the nonprofit to monitor and assess and respond and change and shift. Management is the ability to manage your resources, and technical capacity is the ability to implement key organizational and program functions. Okay? And so, now organizational culture is part of the CCAT has been added relatively over the last couple of years because culture has become more a part of kind of the nonprofit discussion about how important culture is, right? That you can't do any of that if you have a really angry staff and that your board is culturally challenged, let's say that, right? So those are kind of the capacities that it looks at. Okay. So what's going to happen is there's going to be a report that comes from the CCAT. And so you're going to see from those, what you're going to see from a CCAT report is one, it's going to talk about your core capacity scores, right? So it's going to give you scores, numerical scores about how you look there. Now, in the States, the great thing about the CCAT and what we're trying to develop here in Northern Ireland and Scotland is a baseline so that you can be compared and contrasted versus your other peers. Because this is new here, you'd be compared against Americans, and as we all know, you're much more awesome than American nonprofits. So your core capacity scores will come out, the overall adaptive leadership, they'll give you a general score there. And then in all the sub-indicators, there'll be scores against that. And in a second, I'll explain what the scores are. And then within this report, they kind of say where you are on the life cycle. And I'll just say as an aside, I think the most valuable part of the CCAT report is the scores. The life cycle is kind of hard to do without somebody actually talking to you, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then within the CCAT report, they give you kind of computer-generated, these are things that you should look at. You should know as a part of this project, those can be helpful, but you'll also get a one-on-one or discussion about what your scores mean. So the idea is not to just give you scores and say, okay, shove off, I hope this works well. The idea is that you'll get some one-on-one discussion about what your scores mean and how you should look at it. And then there's some stuff in the document about how they get to the number. The CCAT is built on algorithm, so the 146 questions don't exactly relate to one bar. There's a variety of different kind of metrics that are going on. So from my perspective at the CCAT, what I found to be real, if I had to assess the CCAT, at its worst, the CCAT is about 80% correct on how your organization looks. And at its best, it's about 95% correct. Most of the time, organizations, when they get their CCAT back, say, yeah, this is me. Now, sometimes organizations say, I'm not so sure. And that's all right. There's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes groups will say, this is crazy. And I'll be honest with you, most of the time those organizations are like that. They're mostly dysfunctional. But it's still okay to question the CCAT, but in my opinion, in the most part, it's about 80 to 95% correct, which is actually, if you're looking at assessment tools, a pretty good place to be. Okay. So when you see scores come up, which you'll see, you're going to see different, there's three ranges. You're going to see scores that are anywhere from 230 to 300. That means your organization is very strong in that area. Okay. It's very rare to see 300. If I see a 300, I think there's something wrong, right? It's that rare, right? But 230 to 300 means your organization's strong in that area. 190 to 229 is the satisfactory range, and if you're at 229, you're very satisfactory, and if you're at 191, you're barely satisfactory. And then below 190 means that the organization is experiencing challenge in that specific area. And the farther below 190 you are, the more challenge you have in that specific place. Okay? And so the idea is you could see an overall score in adaptive capacity and say, okay, well, why is my score at 195? And then you'll look and you'll say, wow, in adaptive capacity it shows that our environmental learning is bad, or we have challenges there. And that means you're not as good as kind of learning about your external environment, and your score there is like 110, and that's driving the overall score low. So you'll be able to see that and see what's potentially driving it, or you'll be super high, and you'll have two scores that are driving your score way up. So you'll be able to see the variations within that. Okay? So here's an example of what you would see in adaptive capacity. I'm assuming eyes can't see this, so I'm going to point if that's okay. So what we do here, and again, we're not doing comparisons, but eventually the idea is we will be able to take your numbers and crunch them. You won't see it in the CCAT report, but you'll see it in other places. But In adaptive, we look at decision-making tools, environmental learning, organizational learning, which is how the organization learns from itself. Organizational resource sustainability is how does the organization maintain its resources when there is a slight shift. So sometimes funders can be fickle, right? I'm a funder, I admit that. So sometimes funding can shift. A real key to organizational adaptive strength is how does the organization respond when there are those shifts? In organizational resource sustainability, program resources adaptability, and finally, how does the program learn? That's basically, yes, we do evaluation, but does the organization move from those evaluations? So those are the scores, and you can see this organization was high in most organizations except program resource adaptability. And what that means is this organization lost some program funding and wasn't able to sustain those programs, okay? And so that might mean strategically a number of different things, right? So that's typically what you'll see in a report, okay? Now what we do, because we're nerdy, is we are going to take all that data in all of the categories, and we're going to look at it in terms of, you know, how did they look organizations under 1 million or different budget sizes. And you can see here, this is an analysis of a group of 75 nonprofits in the Philadelphia and southern New Jersey area, okay? And we found in that area that organizations were really suffering from outreach and marketing skills. They had a really hard time as a community talking about themselves. And what they would say is, we don't like to talk about ourselves. And it was evident because no one in the community knew of their programs really. So if you think about it from a broad sense, if you're a funder, wow, if most of the organizations in our community are suffering from this, maybe as a funder this is something that I can do. Or for a group like CO3 or other intermediaries, they could say, wow, we can develop a capacity building program around this. So I look at this as, if you ever seen like a DNA chart, putting all the data together and seeing where the red and the yellow areas come up, and then being able to say these are areas that we can concentrate on. And that's certainly going to be a part of this project, okay? And then this was one in which we looked at organizations that had a decrease in funding or operational funds by less than 10%, over 20%. This was due to the economic crisis. And largely, what was the biggest challenge they were having for declining organizations in resources, right? So you can cut and slice this data in a million different ways to help really kind of get really pinpoint about how organizations can be supported, but also how organizations can support each other. Okay. Okay. And so for those that have been with me the last couple of days in the interim executive training, we talked a lot about Lifecycle. But the Lifecycle thought is now if you see all of these numbers for your organization, one of the things that we can do is be able to say, wow, of the 36 indicators, 29 of your 36 are below 190. Well, that might show you as an organization that's in a declining place. Now, it's all right to be in a declining place. All organizations go through decline. But then you can kind of see what kind of things you need to do. Organizational capacity is different depending on where you are on the life cycle. So for example, fundraising is different for groups that are growing versus declining, yes? Your pitch is different, all these things are different. Evaluation is different, lots of things are different. And so the scores can help kind of say where you are on the life cycle and what kind of support you may need depending on where all those scores come out. Okay. So typically how groups have responded to this little chart says here, happiness is just around the corner. All you have to do is work harder, raise more money, do more things, and then you can keep going. And that's been the typical response to not having data and somebody saying, you look kind of challenged, and then you think you do this and it's going to be better. So we have been evaluating programs for a long time, right? But what we haven't been doing, which is more important, is analyzing organizational health. If you're going to a company and you want to buy a stock, you're not going to just look at the product. You're going to look at the health of the company, yes? If they're stumbling and crumbling, but they've got a great a great set of cookies, you're not going to be like, all right, well, I'm going to invest in that company. It's the same thing for third sector organizations, is that we want to analyze and collect data because we believe that organizational health is as important, if not more important, than just looking at program outcomes. Okay. So we're going to look at data in a more oriented way, spot issues and strengths, as you saw from those kind of DNA slides, and then be able to have a conversation together based on what that data says. If we realize all, 50 groups, let's say you all take the CCAT, and we realize, like Pittsburgh, where we had 100 groups take the CCAT, that their biggest issue in that community was they had lots of really great leader vision, that's awesome, but they had unbelievable worry about leadership sustainability. And the reason is that most of the executive directors in that city were about 60 to 65 years old, and no one had succession plans. And that was a massive issue in that community. And so the data said this is an area that we need to concentrate on. And they had several universities in the area that had programs, but none of them dedicated on this. They also realized a huge issue around capital, that everybody needed more space. They were in crumbling buildings. And so funders created an online space so that people could share if they had open offices in their own buildings, and they had kind of a capital space exchange. All of that came from looking at the data and saying, together, these are solutions that we need to do that might be able to help all of us. Okay, so that's a big advantage. It provides a context for discussion with agencies on their current state, how they're going to do their priorities, how they're going to map out plans. So now, the last 7 years, I've been concentrating a lot of my energy on working with funders to have better conversations with their grantees, because sometimes those conversations aren't as helpful as we would like. And so by providing this data to funders as a whole, not individually, but you might also sit down with your funder and show this data individually and say, this is what we're going through. Often we end up wearing our Sunday best and we take 2 years to have the right conversation. This data allows us to have the right conversation right from the start. Does that make sense? So that's helpful. We're able to do analysis by sector, by region, by different group, organizational types, by budget sizes, a variety of different ways we can cut this data to be able to really get at what are the issues. Funders can use this to help think about their organizational and how they're going to make investments, but organizations can use this data to say where are they going to spend energy over the next couple of years on their capacity, right? So one of the big features in Pittsburgh of this data was we realized that organizations that had overhead rates of 20% or lower had worse organizational capacity, right? And organizations that had actually overhead rates of 26 to 31% actually were stronger from an organizational capacity. So what that did in Pittsburgh is it caused a number of funders to say, we need to stop forcing groups to have overhead rates of 15% or lower, right? That's a healthy conversation to have. The data led that discussion, right? And that can be really helpful. And then obviously it can let us see trends and get out in front of those trends potentially. So if we start to see yellows in certain areas, or we start to see the data showing potential danger areas in the future, we might be able to get ahead on that, right? Similar to what they did in Pittsburgh with millennials. They knew that there was a growing millennial population and that were serving in mid-level leadership roles, and there was nothing to help them develop into senior level roles where the senior executives would be leaving in the next several years. Okay. So for you and your organization, why is this awesome, I hope? One is it gives you a data-driven snapshot of how your organization is looking in a variety of really important areas, how you're performing in a management area, and where you're potentially vulnerable. That's always helpful, right? Anybody not like to, I don't care, I don't need to learn about the weaknesses of my organization? That's always a helpful thing, yes? The second one is it gets the right dialogue going. So when I go and meet with those groups, I say, tell me your challenges. And if there's 25 people in the room, I get 25 different responses of what's wrong with the organization, right? That's difficult when you can't have everybody on the same page about what really is the difficulties of this organization. I think we should do more fundraising. I think we need to do this. This allows us to get central, your organizations to get central on what are really the key issues that you're facing. There's the idea behind this project is we're going to do a pre and post. So in a couple years, we're going to come back and do another CCAT analysis. And we'll be able to see, you're going to get your report back. You're going to say, wow, I'm doing really well here. Let's high five each other. And I'm having some challenges here. Let's work on this over the next couple of years. You're going to self-correct. That's the best kind of capacity building, is you self-correcting. But then also there's going to be some other resources that Nora will talk to you about. But at the end, we're going to come back and say, all right, let's take this again. And you'll be able to see if there were improvements and things like that. And that's really healthy. But you'll be around those set metrics. You can have a focused discussion with grant makers about exactly what's going on, right? And I think grant makers appreciate the idea of, grant makers love this, from what I can attest to, of seeing where your challenges are, having an open conversation, and being really crystal clear about how they can support you in this vein. Wouldn't that nice to have a more constructive conversation with funders, knowing exactly how they can help you? That's always a plus. And then you can benchmark your results against how your peers are doing. The cool thing is we'll be able to go and say, how do we look against Scotland, right? What's going on there? How do our youth organizations look against that? That's actually the first time the CCAT's ever been used in this way, so I'm pretty excited about that. And you should be too. So, where's this data going to be, right? Like, who's going to see this stuff, right? Well, first, it's a very small select number of folks are going to see the individual data. So a couple people at CO3 who are going to be putting the data into buckets to analyze, right? Myself. But it's not like I'm going to be sitting back eating popcorn saying, oh, look at Bespoke Childcare and look at their numbers, right? We're looking at the data to be able to analyze it, right? None of the public reports are going to be individual. They'll all be aggregate. So we're going to be talking about the numbers as a whole, okay? And no funders or any other organizations outside of that will ever get your individual data, okay? So all the data is, only way we're going to see it is when we're aggregating it, and then when you have your one-on-one explaining to you what the data means. Cool? Okay. I think that's it on my side.